If you have a Bible and find it helpful, please turn into 1 Corinthians chapter 3. This is where we're going to spend our time today. One of the aspects of the culture in which we live, and I'm sure you all are quite aware of this, is that for the most part, as we go through life, most people are driven to accomplish things. They're driven to grow. They're driven to be more than they are. We raise our children. We raise them up to dig their heels in and to do and to be and to become. We don't want them to just float through life. We want them to pursue things. And we admire that. We admire people who move up. People who move into the places in the world where they weren't previously. But the problem is, and it speaks to what we would call ambition. And ambition is a good thing, but it's a thing that has been twisted by sin, as with most qualities we have. And you've heard this, I'm sure, but I'll never forget it. I don't even know where I was when I saw it. A TV evangelist got on television and was advertising a teaching that he wanted everybody to have. This is back when you got these things on cassettes. And he said, "This is the most powerful teaching that you can have on how it is to walk with God." I thought, wow, that's a pretty bold claim. And why would he say that? I don't think there's anything new under the sun. Personally, the same Bible. You're going to take the same Bible I'm reading, and this is going to be the most powerful teaching that you can possibly have on how it is to walk with God. I think Paul did a pretty good job already, but nevertheless, what's going on? He wants you to buy the cassettes. What's driving that? Ambition. Ambition. Shakespeare said this. He said, "Ambition obeys no law but its own appetite." And then he adds, "By that sin, the angels fell." That's something to consider. Let's look at this text. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, I'll begin reading in verse 5. One of my favorite texts in the whole of the Bible. What is Apollos really? What is Paul? Servants through whom you came to believe. And each of us in the ministry the Lord gave to us. I planted, Apollos watered, but God caused it to grow. So neither the one who plants counts for anything, nor the one who waters, but God who causes the growth. The one who plants and the one who waters work as one, but each will receive a reward according to their work. We are co-workers belonging to God. You are God's field, God's building. According to the grace of God given to me, like a skilled master builder, I laid a foundation, but someone else builds on that. And each one must be careful how they build, for no one can lay any foundation other than that which has been laid, which is Jesus Christ. If anyone builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, or straw, each builder and each builder's work will be plainly be seen, for the day will make it clear, because it will be revealed by fire. And the fire will test what kind of work it is that each has done. If what someone has built survives, they will receive a reward. If someone's work is burned up, they will suffer loss. But they themselves will be saved, but only as through fire. Do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit lives in you? If someone destroys God's temple, God will destroy that one. For God's temple is holy, which is what you are. Guard against self-deception, each one of you. If someone among you thinks they are wise in this age, let them become foolish so that they can become wise. For the wisdom of this age is foolishness with God, as it is written, God catches the wise in their craftiness. And again, the Lord knows the thoughts of the wise are futile. So then, no more boasting about mere mortals. Everything belongs to you, whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas, or the world or life or death, or the present or the future. Everything belongs to you. And you belong to Christ, and Christ belongs to God. Well, there's a ton of theology there, and we're not going to get into most of that ton today. But I do want to focus on one thing. This passage is so potent in what it says about who we are to be. we are, all of us, no matter who we are, no matter what station we think we occupy, we are nothing but servants. I mean, after all, if Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles, or Peter, or Apollos, or any of them, the word servant there is a very descriptive translation. It's the Greek word huperetos, which literally means the slave in the bottom of the ship. The Roman ships had rowers. They were chained to the oars. That's a huperetos, chained to the oars. So Paul is saying something about himself here and about other servants that we should take to heart. And I think a lot of us don't. Sometimes people are thrust into God's service. I think most of the time that's how it goes. Paul says he was compelled to preach. Does that mean he was like drafted? Well, kind of. He was kind of drafted into it. But any believer, none of us who are believers, will really have true rest as believers until we are serving as God would have us serve. Whatever God has called you or me to be, until we're doing that, we will not find rest. Position means nothing in God's kingdom, but calling means everything. Some people avoid calling, and they do so because they're afraid. Now, I can understand that. God may send me somewhere nasty, right? I don't want to go somewhere nasty. But I can say this, talk to any missionary, and I've talked to a lot of them, and I've talked to some of them who were in very dire, dangerous places. They would tell you to your face, if you talk to them about being where they are, there is no place on the earth they would rather be. That's amazing to me. I mean, when I look at how some of the missionaries I've met have to live, I mean, grass huts, dirt floors, you know, a lot of the missionaries that I've met in my travels were missionary nationals. That is, maybe they were from Sudan, and they just happened to make a mission conference in America. And they lived like all the other Sudanese in their village. But they would have it no other way. They've been to America, they see what it's like to live here, but they'd rather be where they are. That is God's calling on life. God calls us where we are, not where we want to be. Now, we get so fixated on where am I going? Like where I'm going is so important. But it's not. Where I am is where all of us, where we are, that's where God is calling us to be. Now, there may be somewhere to go, but I don't know what it is, do you? I don't have a clue. But I do know where I am, and there are things that God brings in front of us every day where we have an opportunity to be salt and light for somebody in some way. I remember once I was traveling and I met this evangelist. He said something that has stuck with me for the rest of my life, and this is at least 30 years ago, probably 40. He said, you know, I look around and I see what God is doing, and I just try to get on board with that. Boy, that's different, isn't it? That's a different way to look at life as something that's coming at him because God is bringing it at him or her. And he says, this happened to be a man, he just said, I want to get on board with what God's already doing. For believers, there can be good ambitions and there can be bad ones. A career can be a good thing. It can be if it's seen as a means to an end. But if everything's about position, that's not good. That's bad and it's destructive. And if it's something that defines us, it's even more destructive. If our definition of who we are is not who God has called us to be, if it's something that we're trying to become and that's going to define us, that's a destructive ambition. C.S. Lewis says this, he says, I love this, the one who wants to be or tries to be an original will not be. The one who simply does a good job will be. That is so true. That is so true. And if we're pursuing something and we're not comfortable without some kind of title, then that's a bad ambition. It really is. I mean, ambition is a passion that is given to us by God. There's no question about that. But it has been twisted by fallenness until it can become very, very destructive. Think about it like this. What would be the ambition for Adam and Eve? Their ambition is to just be who God made them to be. That was it, right? They were put in the garden. They were given the whole world. Everything is yours. Wow. Think of that. And yet there's only one rule. Don't eat that one. But everything else is yours. Be fruitful and multiply. That's your job. In other words, the ambition you have is to be who I've made you to be. I don't think anything's changed very much, to be honest with you. That is still the ambition that we're supposed to have. That would be a proper ambition, to be who God has called us to be. Galatians chapter 5 tells us all kinds of things about how we are to be in terms of being a changed person. And I think Paul's onto something here, because it seems to me the very first mission field we have to conquer is the one that lies between our ears, not so much the one that's out there. Once we conquer the one between our ears, things tend to clear up a lot. He says this, "For the whole law can be summed up in a single commandment. You must love your neighbor as yourself. However, if you continually bite and devour one another, be aware that you're not consumed by one another. But I say, live by the Spirit, and you will not carry out the desires of the flesh. For the flesh has desires that are opposed to the Spirit, and the Spirit has desires that are opposed to the flesh. For these are in opposition to each other, so that you can't do what you want." Wow. I mean, after our conversion, Paul continues on in the next chapter in Galatians to tell us that we are in a state of constantly crucifying who we are so that we live for who he is in us. How do you do that? Right? How do you accomplish that? Well, I love what that evangelist said. He said, I'm going to look out there and see what God is already doing, and I'm going to jump on board and do that. That makes a ton of sense. Paul says in Philippians chapter 4 that he learned contentment. That tells me something. That says it's not just something that automatically comes. Now, I know when I got born again, I don't know what it was like for you. I remember. And when I first became born again, there was just, the grass was greener, the sky was bluer, the breeze was nicer, food tasted better. Everything in the world just looked different to me. It was awesome. But it doesn't take long before that goes away to some degree. And I think intentionally. God gives us that period of time. It's kind of like marriage, right? I love what George Bernard Shaw said about marriage. Think about this. He said, I'm paraphrasing, but this is close. Why is it that we take two people in the most excitable condition of their entire lives, then bring them up to an altar and make them swear to stay in that excited, constantly wearing, tiring, exhausting condition for the rest of their lives? That's not the way marriage is. All of us know that, right? It's not. And it's the same with being born again. It's so different once we step out of the world into God's world. But then we have to live in this one. And that starts to wear us down. And we learn contentment. Paul says, I know contentment. He didn't get it all at once. He had to learn it. He had to learn it by banging into this world as a believer and allowing God to mold him into a person who could find contentment wherever they were. Kind of like the missionaries in dangerous places. I don't want to be anywhere else. Why? God has made me so content there that I would never want to leave it unless God called me to leave it. I remember a friend of mine, this is another one of those things where somebody just says one little thing and it sticks in your head the rest of your life. This person, we were talking about this kind of question, and he said, you know, I just want to live consistently before the Lord. I thought, wow, there's a life's work, if ever there was one. The biblical narratives are so distorting to us because they They compress so much time. We look at somebody like an Elijah, and we see James. Remember, James even says, Elijah prayed and it stopped raining. Elijah prayed and it rained. You, James points to us, that you're no different. But it's hard for us to see that because you read Elijah, you can read the whole history of Elijah in just a few minutes. I mean, 30 minutes, you've read the entire passage in the Bible relative to Elijah's life and work. That's 25 years. He did 8 miracles that are in the Bible. You do the math as how often a miracle occurred over 25 years, if there's only 8 of them. They weren't just happening every day. So it's like Eugene Peterson says. He says, what is the faithful life? He says it's long obedience in one direction. And that's a good definition. We expect, I'm guilty of this, we expect that because we're born again that we're going to pray and things are just going to flash into a different composition necessarily. That's not how it goes. We all kind of know that, don't we? But there's a sense, I think, maybe it's just me, a sense of frustration in that. Because I want to see God work like it looks like he worked then. But I forget Elijah's life is a 25-year work, not just 30 minutes while I read through the pages of the story in the Bible. And what do we typically do? Typically, we're not like the evangelist who says, I just want to find out what God's doing and get on board. No, we choose to do something and then we retroactively ask God, please bless what we're already choosing to do. That's generally how that goes. Now, I'm not saying that's wrong. Maybe that's the best we can do at the time. But you know, God calls people where they are. Let me give you an example. Johann Sebastian Bach. Who was he? He was one of the greatest composers of the classical era in music. His stuff is still played today. People make their livings playing Bach today. Okay, at the bottom of every piece of music he ever wrote, and he wrote a bunch of them, he says, Soli Deo Gloria, which means to God alone the glory. Was Bach a missionary? No. Did Bach start a soup kitchen? No. He wrote music. God called him to be where he was, who he was, and Bach did that. What's God already doing in Bach? He's making him a musician. So Bach says, you know what, I'll just get on that train and go for a ride. And he did. Bach was simply being himself surrendered to God, just like the two humans when we started out. There's an effect. You may not know of this. I didn't know of it until a few years back. It's a funny name. It's called the Zeigarnik effect. Have you ever heard of the Zeigarnik effect? Here's what it means. This is the best illustration I've got. So you're playing music in front of a crowd. And you look out there and a lot of people they're enjoying what you're doing. But there's one lady down in front. She's hating every minute of it. And you see her face, and the other 600 people that are having a good time, you forget all about them, and all you can think about is the one lady in the front who's not having a good time. That's how we are. We focus on those things that we come to a point and we fail, and we focus on the memory of the failure. We don't think about all the good things that came about because of that journey. We forget all about it, and all we think about is the fact that we failed. I'm like that. And what ambition is a way to relieve that itch. That's what it is. It's a way to say, I'm going to pursue and work and pursue and climb and scratch because I don't like the feeling of seeing the one lady out in front of me who doesn't like what I'm doing. And I don't like thinking about the places where I've failed. And that becomes our whole life. That's where ambition becomes twisted by sin. Now the church in Corinth to whom Paul writes this letter, they were ambitious. Why? Because God had gifted that church. God was doing all kinds of stuff in Corinth. There were people standing up with prophecies and people healing people and people standing up with words of knowledge about so-and-so and words of wisdom and every supernatural thing that God does in the human race. Corinth was experiencing it. And people wanted to be luminaries in that crowd. So they think, Okay, I want God to do X, Y, and Z through me, just like he does it through Mary or Fred. Maybe God's not calling you to be Mary or Fred. That's why Paul says, who is Paul, who is Apollos? Servants. Servants. Always servants. We're a priesthood of believers. Do you know what Christianity has done relative to the laity and the clergy? There is no laity. There's no laity. Everybody's a member of the clergy. Everybody. If you call the name of Jesus, you've become a member of the clergy. You're now a member of the priesthood of believers. Every person. With all the responsibilities that entails for prayer and everything else. So the wars that were being fought, that Paul had to write his letter to the church in Corinth about, what were they fighting about? They're fighting about who's the best. Who's the most recognized? I'm for Paul. Oh, I'm for Peter. I'm for Apollos. And Paul says, what's the matter with you? You're all trying to be something, and God just wants you to be who he's made you to be, and that's it. So there was a fear of not being recognized. And it was just straight away from the ambition that they all felt. That's what drives that ambition, that I'm not going to be seen. And if we have an ambition that doesn't show up the fruit of the Spirit in the pursuit, then that's not a godly ambition. It's just not. If it takes away from the fruit of the Spirit, it's not a godly ambition, or at least the way we're pursuing it is not godly. If the fruit of the Spirit is undermined by our pursuit of ambition, then we need to adjust the ambition. Think about it. I mean, how do you reconcile a godly ambition and no fruit produced? That doesn't even make any sense to me. So calling and fruit can't be at war. If they are, there's something wrong. So how do we check that, right? What do you do? I mean, you take a piece of paper and say, okay, here's the places where the fruit's good and here's the places where it's not. Maybe, but think about a few examples here, if you would, just for a minute. Instead of loving people, are people dispensable to you or me? Do we think we can just use people for our pleasure or contentment and then move on, leave them? Instead of joy, instead of being a joyful person, are we an ogre to other people? Instead of peace, do we have such inner turmoil that it's bleeding out into everybody else's life? Instead of patience, are we defensive? Instead of kindness, are we harsh? Instead of faithfulness to somebody, are we disloyal when it becomes inconvenient? Instead of gentleness, are we overbearing and controlling? Instead of self-control, do we allow the ends to justify any means we choose to use? If ambition causes any of these things, it's not a godly ambition. A godly ambition will produce fruit always. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything about which you've got a